You remember reading what happened to the kingdom? It was hit with plagues. Blessing and curse, blessing and curse, blessing and curse. Abraham was trying to save his life, his own skin, but in the process, God was protecting Sarah. And in the process of him protecting Sarah, somehow the king was understood, I'm not going to be with this woman because it's going to be bad. But anyway, a plague broke out in result of that. Did you ever look up the name of Abraham? Abraham, before his name was changed from Abram to Abraham, in the Hebrew language, Abram means a father exalted. Abraham means father of a multitude. God had a purpose in changing his name. So Abraham lied. What else did you discover about one of the weaknesses of Abraham?
He didn't trust or, I guess, demonstrate faith in God.
Okay.
In some of his actions.
Okay.
To save himself.
So you think he had doubts? Yeah. How many years went by before he was told that you're going to be a father? And how many, until, of course, Ishmael came along 10 years later, but until he received the promise of Isaac, how many years passed? Did you calculate? 25 years. Now, for Abraham, 25 years may or may not have been a long time. I know his dad lived to be over 200 years old, and I really didn't look up Abraham's final life, but it was not uncommon for people to live several hundred years. But when Abraham first heard this from God, what was his reaction to God when God said, you're going to be a father? What did he do? What did Sarah do? Laughed. They both doubted, how could this be possible? At that time, Abraham was 90, I think, thereabouts, and Sarah was 75. Not uncommon for there to be a big age difference in husband and wife in those days, even today. But they laughed. That was their first response, because Sarah had been barren all their life, all their married life. She'd never had a child. Then all of a sudden, another weakness appears to Abraham about 10 years after that promise. And what did he do in response to what Sarah suggested? Yeah. Sarah said, take my servant lady and have a child with her. Maybe this is the way to fulfill God's promise. You see, when we get humanity mixed in with God's purpose and plans, it usually messes it up, pretty much. So he, not saying that he should not have listened to his wife, but I think he thought, well, maybe this is our way of helping this purpose and this plan to be fulfilled. Instead of depending on his connection and spirit connection with God, he allowed his flesh to do that for him. So, can God use imperfect people? If he can't, why are we in this room? Because he does. He doesn't choose us because we're perfect. He chose Abraham because Abraham was available and obedient and had that willing attitude to serve. And that's what God looks for. He looks at the heart on how he wants us to respond to him. He doesn't look at all of our gifts and all of our abilities and who we are and where we come from and all of the heritage that we might bring and offer to him. But he can surely use it. God does not discount it. What are some of the ways that we can respond to God's call like Abraham? Excuse me? Being obedient. That there's times that people would come to me and they would ask questions. Pastor, how do we obey the Lord? And I said, it's simple. Start reading in your Bible. If you want to start in the book of Matthew, that's a good place because that's where Jesus comes on the scene. And every time Jesus gives a command, be obedient to it. Well, what does that mean? I said, well, he will never give you another one till you follow the first one. And that's the way it was with Abraham. Abraham was a patriarch or a person in process. Step by step, place by place. He ended up in 13 geographical markers. When you take that whole journey of Abraham and mark everywhere he made an altar, where God appeared to him, where God spoke to him again. Whether it was an audible voice, we don't know, because Moses wasn't there to hear the account. Abraham was the one who told these stories, and it passed on from generation to generation to his children, through his grandchildren, down to Moses. A lot of the recorded history in Scripture was what we call oral history. Nothing written. Until Moses came on the scene and started writing the first 5 books of Scripture, it was all story form. They would sit around, and you remember when they came out of Egypt from the Passover, they were given bracelets and necklaces and said, write these commandments on your doorposts so that you remember these. And so they would tell the stories to the children, and it would pass on from generation to generation until people were able to even write on paper or scrolls, in those days, parchment. There was nothing written. It was all communicated orally. In studying oral cultures through missiology in Asia particularly, I learned a lot, because when I set up the training center in Chiang Mai to train 5 major missionary sending groups, our young people would come to our center and be trained over about 3 or 4 week training session, and then they would go back out to their country, and then a couple months later we'd get them back and do that back and forth. And we taught them how to do oral presentations, because 80% of all of Asia is still oral communicated. That's how they don't. If I was in my comfort zone, would have a PowerPoint presentation up there, and I'd be sitting here showing you all of this by PowerPoint. That's where my comfort zone is. In 80% of all of Asia, it's not that way. It's all communicated orally to this very day. One of my good close friends who was a researcher, a missiologist researcher, told us this story about a young man, I forget which country. He earned a scholarship in American University. He came to the U.S., he studied to where he earned his PhD. He went back to his country and began teaching in the university. And because the teaching methodology was so different than what he had learned here, he had to readapt his teaching methodology. And in 5 years, he went from a PhD, very literate, very explanatory with all kinds of technology, to a person communicating to his classroom orally. Totally oral. Because that's what research tells us. You can take a person from a culture, from a country, from whatever linguistic background, give them a high form of education. But if they don't keep doing it that way, they revert, because that's the comfort zone. In Hebrew culture, it was a culture of stories, and they would tell these encounters with God. Abraham told about to his children and his grandchildren about his encounter with God and why he left his country of birth to go to a different country, and the stories that happened all along the way. Obviously, this passed down to Moses under divine inspiration. Moses recorded the life of Abraham. Do you know how many times the name Abraham occurs in Scripture? Do a word study on some Bible app, and you'll find his name appears 150 times, all through Scripture. Over into the New Testament, we see his name mentioned many times. Paul the Apostle puts him in what we would call the Hall of Fame of the great and faithful. Did you read that over in Hebrews 11? Did I give that to you to look at? Okay. Do you have it where you can read it to me, Alexa? Read it for me. What does it say?
You want just verse 11?
Yes.
By faith, even Sarah herself received power to conceive seed when she was past age, since she counted him faithful who had promised.
How old was she when she had the baby? 90. I have heard, since I've lived here in Las Cruces, that there have been grandmothers to become surrogates for their grandchild. And one particular grandmother who was in her 60s gave birth to her grandchild. In our day of great technology, that's possible. But for a 90-year-old woman, back in the days of Abraham, when he was alive, that was unheard of. Most women would have their childbearing years between 15 and 35, the majority. And after 35, there would be no more children, normally. So here she is. But Abraham is called and part of the heroes or the Hall of Faith. All of you know about Cooperstown, right? The Sports World's Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York, where people get their name written after being sports heroes. Well, the Bible has that in Hebrews chapter 11. It's the Hall of Fame of the faithful. And Abraham has a big chunk of that chapter. And some people, I think Paul, the apostle, was one who wrote the book of Hebrews. There's a lot of theological disagreement on who wrote it, but I am of the opinion that he wrote it. And because we find something else that Paul mentions of him, about Abraham, in Galatians and in Romans. And he talks about Abraham being justified by faith. How could Abraham be justified by faith when Jesus had not died? Have you ever thought about that? How could Abraham know that Jesus was going to be born? He knew that just because of his encounter with God, and God saying, "Get up, go to a place I will show you." By faith, he trusted God to take him to that country, and by faith, he trusted God that through Abraham's seed would come the seed that would be implanted in Mary for Jesus to be born. What was God's declaration to Abraham about the stars and the sand? How many stars are there? That's a good answer. My wife has a cousin, first cousin. He has worked for NASA for about 40 years. I remember when Frida and I were dating, he would be out in his backyard. His house was close to Frida's house, several hundred yards apart. But he, at 10, 11, 12 years old, he'd already made a telescope about 12 years old, and he was stargazing. And he would be out in the yard looking at the stars and the planets. Dr. Michael Summers has 4 doctor's degrees. I don't know how many books he's written. He's one of the few Christian scientists that I know about, and he's written books that we read. And he says there's a whole group of scientists like him because he's worked from Washington, D.C., taught in several major universities, including universities in California. And he said in our most recent visit with him that scientists have been able to discover 2 billion stars. Now, I have trouble with the first billion. I don't have that many fingers. But he said there's 2 billion. I said, how can you determine that? He said, well, you take a section of space, and a certain section, and you count those that are in that section. And then you use a calculation of all the rest of space, and you come to that number. Now, could they be off? Sure, they could. But when you think about 2 billion stars, how many grains of sand are there on Earth? One of my favorite places in all the world is a place called Playuela Beach. It's where I used to go scuba diving and snorkeling when we could have a time off and have a family day. Never got to stay more than a day ever at any time during the year, except because it was a day trip from my house down to the coast and then to the island by a little boat. And I used to love to go there because it was, some days we could have the whole island to ourselves. It was sort of like Key West, Florida, where you have islands together that come into the different small islands out of Key West. Well, this was a chain of islands of 18 of them off the northern coast of Venezuela in the Caribbean. And Playuela was 45 minutes from ocean shore to the island. And we'd pay a boat driver to take us out there. Early on, in the early days, $10 was all it costs. You could have a day trip for all the family for $10. And so we would go out, and he would always say, what time you want to come back? And we would say the hour we'd like to come back, and he was always there to get us. Never failed in all the years. He never got paid to the end of the day, thank God, because he could have left us on that island overnight. But that had the most beautiful white sand along the seashore. But the ocean and the coral reef that was out on that little inlet, I used to take my younger son when he was like 2 years old and bought him some fins and snorkel and mask, and he would follow Dad, and we would swim out from shore, maybe 300 yards, maybe 1,000 foot from shoreline, and we'd get over top of this coral reef, and at the reef, it would break off and go straight down to the bottom of the ocean at that point. And I'm going to tell you the truth here, and I'll get back to Abraham in a second. We were talking about sand, right? That's the reason I'm talking about the beach. And so I went down with my scuba equipment to see how deep I was seeing from the surface, because I could see the bottom from surface. And I had my depth gauge on with my scuba equipment. And when I got and saw that, I could not believe what I was seeing on my depth gauge. I could see from surface to the bottom, and from the bottom to the surface, 85 feet, clear as crystal. Now, here in Cruces, you can't see the bottom of most swimming pools, and they're 8 or 10 feet deep. But I say that to say this, is that there's a lot of sand in the world, and Abraham's descendants are scattered all over the world, and they outnumber the stars, and they outnumber the sand. Out of one man came one son, really two sons. And out of those two sons changed the world, religiously speaking. Through Abraham's faith, and through the birth of Isaac, and through the birth of Ishmael, came three major world religions. What are they? That's one. Yes. Judaism, or Judaism. How many Jewish people are there in the world by religion, not ethnicity? How many people in the world would consider themselves Jewish by religion? Do you know? I wrote that down in my notes. Let me find it. It's on your questionnaire. It's the very last question. In Judaism, those who claim Judaism as their religion, 14.7 million. Not by ethnicity, but by religion. 14.7 million. Ethnicity, there would probably be that many or more. So I'm just going to estimate out of all of the world, somewhere around 30 million would be either identified themselves as Jewish by religion or Jewish by ethnicity or birth. How many Muslims are there in the world? What's the biggest Islamic nation in the world? No. Not even close. No, not even close. And it's not in the Middle East. That's a clue. That's where we first gravitate. You know, our mind go there. But the largest Islamic nation in the world is Indonesia. Yes. Indonesia. And Indonesia is a country of, they say, 13,000 islands. It's just huge. They've identified at least that many. 13,000 more or less. Islam came into Indonesia at a place called Banda Aceh. Ever hear that name? Ever hear the tsunami of 2004? That's where it hit. Banda Aceh. That's where my daughter lived. And her husband and her firstborn son. That's where they lived, in that town. When they went there in the early, around 2000, 2001, they knew of no known Christians in Banda Aceh. We refer to it as BA now. The world never heard of BA until the tsunami hit it. And on December 26, 2004, while Lori and Jason and Nico were at my house for Christmas in Chiang Mai with my older son and my younger son. Older son lived here, he flew there, and younger son was still going to school there. We went to church that morning. None of us got up and turned on any device like computer or TV. Got up, got dressed, went to church. Came home after lunch, and I sat down. I don't know if I turned the TV or I think it was a computer, and I saw the headline, Tsunami Hits Indonesia. And I told my son-in-law, Jason, to turn on the TV, and then we saw it. And he said, we've got to go home. We've got to get back. And so he started calling his missionary leadership, and they said, well, get home as quickly as you can. Everybody's trying to leave, and you want to go home? That's kind of opposite way to do it. But I'm going to summarize a long story short. They knew of no known Christian in BA the 3-4 years prior that they had worked there. No known Christian. If there was somebody who converted from Islam to Christianity, they couldn't tell anybody or they would kill them. Everybody who converted was killed. Now, imagine going in a place like that. When my daughter called me a few years before that and said God was calling her to go preach the gospel to people of Islam, my physical fatherly instinct kicked in 100%. And I said, baby, you know the largest mosque in Latin America is in Caracas, Venezuela? You know the language. It's easier for you to get Muslims to convert to Christianity out of their country. No, Daddy, remember what you said. I said, what'd I say? She said, I went to those conferences with you. I heard you say that over 2 billion people on planet Earth have never heard the name of Jesus, and I want to be one of those that respond to that. So I'm responsible to some extent of my daughter and her husband and her children living in BA, Indonesia. Before they left, after the tsunami had killed somewhere between 250,000 to 400,000 people in that country, the tsunami took lives in 7 different countries. That's how broad it spread across the Indian Ocean. I have been many times to that place where the tsunami hit. I've stood in front of the big mosque that once was there. When the tsunami hit, it took out all the walls except all the pillars and left the pillars and the roof still intact. It just knocked out all the walls. And CNN News back in those days would go by and take photographs of that, so I thought me and my family could do that too, so we had pictures made in front of the mosque. But before Lori and Jason left Indonesia, there were Christian churches being formed in Banda Aceh. And then they called them over to Singapore for 10 years, and they continued working with Muslims all those 10 years in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and all the different countries around Southeast Asia. So, to answer that question, there's 1.9 billion Muslims in the world. 25% of the world's population are Muslim. How many are there under the umbrella of Christianity? Do you know? I'll help you. According to what I just read, 2.4 billion, or 31%, of all branches, all kinds of Christian religions make up that third religious component of Abraham: Judaism, Islam, Christianity. Through Jesus, we get Christianity. Through Islam, we get Muhammad. Through Judaism, we get all the Old Testament, the prophets, the priests, the kings, the rabbis today. So, what happened with Abraham and his nephew Lot? Anything interesting? Excuse me? Separated? Uh-huh. Why did he do that? I can hear you, Sean. Okay. Between whom? Was it between Abraham and Lot? No. Okay. What kind of ranchers were they? They're both ranchers. They had herds. And they both had sheep and other kinds of livestock. But the disagreement came between the guys taking care of the animals. That's where the dispute came. And so, in order to settle it, Abraham said, Lot, choose. Where do you want to take your people and take your animals? Where do you want to go? Where do you go? Sodom and Gomorrah. But he went there not because of that. He went there because it was good grazing land and good water. And if you're a rancher or a farmer, you've got to have water, especially if you're here in Cruces. You live by the water. Because if you don't have water, or you don't have, and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to dig a big well, you can't irrigate. And without that, that was true where they were. It was desert where they were. And so Lot chose the easy way. You know, we have rivers and we have grass, and so we don't have to worry about our animals starving and taking them from place to place. So Abraham gave him a choice. This shows us something about the unselfishness in Abraham. He was not a selfish person. He was very opposite of that, very unselfish. And so he was also a wanderer, wandered around a lot, and everywhere he went, when he had an encounter with God, what did he do? Built an altar. He landmarked his journey by altars and where he had God encounters. Can any of you think about a place that comes right now to your mind where you've had a God encounter? Sometimes it's a church, not all the time. You wanted to say something? Yeah. Some of the encounters that God had with Abraham was out there in the wide open spaces in nature. As long as Abraham lived among the idol worshipers and all the paganism that his father and forefathers had practiced, he didn't know any different. When he got alone with God out there in the desert, traveling on his journey, and had those experiences with God, we can't really determine all that they were. There is no, God said this and I said this and we argued this and we argued that. There seems to be no two-way communication. It just seems God speaks and Abraham obeys. God speaks, Abraham obeys. And he said, I want you to go to a place I will show you. Now, have you ever gone on a trip and you didn't know where you were going? And you just got in your car and said, we'll just let the highway be our guide and just drive down the road? You ever done that? No. We usually have a destination in mind, don't we? But put yourself in Abraham's driver's seat. He had no destination except, I will show you. I will show you. Just get on your camel and ride, and I will show you. To me, that takes a lot of faith. Just to take a voice he had never heard before, a God encounter he had never had before, because that's not the religion he grew up with. That's not what he was told as a child. And now he is a later in life older gentleman at 75, and he just does what God says for him to do. And he gets on that camel and rides. And he rides, and he rides, and he rides. And the total journey was probably something like 500 to 600 miles. Have you ever ridden a camel? I was at a circus some years ago and sat on one, and they did this little pony ride kind of thing in a circle. Have you ever ridden an elephant? No? Well, in Thailand, I rode an elephant. That's the roughest ride I've ever ridden because they had this seat up on this big old elephant, and every time you'd take a step, that the seat would just go back and forth, back and forth. Now, I would have rather been up on his ears where the driver was. That would have been a much smoother ride, but every step, on that elephant. I don't know how far a camel could travel in a day or how far you could take hundreds and hundreds of animals with you on that journey. I have no idea. I just know here in the Old West when they were driving cattle from one place to the other for them to be slaughtered or bought up at auction to be slaughtered later, it took days and days and days for ranchers and cowboys and whomever to corral those cattle and take them to the city where they could be bought. I can't imagine getting on a camel and riding for weeks and weeks and years. I can't imagine. And then waiting for all these herds to catch up. So we could say that Abraham was a wanderer. He was also able to do a few other things in his life, in his faith journey. When I looked at him as the first missionary and making that early commitment to follow God anywhere, the only thing that I couldn't never determine, I don't think Abraham had to learn a different language in order to share his faith journey with individuals. Never did find that. I'm guessing he never had to do that. Even though the Tower of Babel existed about the time of Abraham and all the languages of the world were confused at that time. Nobody could understand how to pass the brick to build the tower anymore. So I don't know if Abraham had to learn a new dialect, the way he spoke, whatever he spoke at the time. We really don't know about that. I want to share a little bit about my own pilgrimage here. When we got to Costa Rica to learn the language that I say is the language everybody will speak in heaven. If you don't know Spanish, you're going to be lost out. So, pobrecitos. Everybody, pobrecitos. So, I know this. The Bible came alive to me when I started reading the Bible in Spanish. The reason being is that the Spanish language is so much more descriptive than our English language. Or at least I feel that. And when people ask me my favorite version, I will say, the Reina Valera Actualizada, because that's the version in Spanish I would read. And when I first came back from overseas, after 4 years coming back, 1 year staying here and going to doing conferences and preaching in churches and teaching in colleges and whatever, I could not feel good about myself as a growing disciple, follower of Jesus, without doing my devotions in Spanish, even though I was living in an English-speaking place. It didn't feel the same. It didn't feel like it was proper for me. It didn't feel, even when I went to hear an English sermon, it didn't seem the same to me. So my devotional life and my prayer life was in Spanish. And it seemed that God communicated to me better through the Spanish language and through the Bible that way. My family didn't understand me. My friends did not understand me. To this day, when I go back to visit the hometown where I grew up, and if I tell you the name of it, you can't even find it on a map. It's so small. The name of the place is Cunningham, West Kentucky. It's 20 miles from Paducah, which is a Native American name. And that's the largest town in the whole area. And the last pastorate I had in Paducah in 1990, at that time, the county had 30,000 people, and that was the largest place. My little town where I grew up had 300 people. We had more cats and dogs than people, more hogs and cattle than people. And by the way, New Mexico has more cattle than people. You probably didn't know that. That's a factoid. But I say that to say this, is that God can find you no matter where you are. And this was my excuse all those years when I knew He was calling for me to enter ministry. I kept saying, you have the wrong address. You have the wrong house. You have the wrong name. You need to go somewhere else. But then I think about how God, I don't doubt my salvation. I don't doubt my calling. I just doubt how God found me in such a small place. And then He has developed in me the ability that I never knew I had. He gave me the opportunity to grow in ways I would have never anticipated. He allowed me to get an education that really got me out of a poverty life cycle that my grandparents and parents had lived in all of my life, and opened the door to a whole new world that I never knew existed. I never traveled more than 50 miles out of that home where I grew up until I got married, and Frida and I decided we were going to see places. And we would travel to different cities and places. But this little country boy, farm boy, poor farm boy from Kentucky, has learned to be comfortable in large places. I mean extremely large places. In the years of 95 to 99, I got to see most all of Latin America. I would travel under my budget that I had at the Spanish Publishing House in El Paso and go and train pastors or train bookstore leaders how to develop a small business and how to make it successful and how to use it as a ministry and how to help churches and church leaders and new Christians grow by the literature we published and they purchased. I remember being in Mexico City at that time in the 90s. Was the largest city in the world. I'm talking large. To get from the airport, which was downtown, my first flight into Mexico City from Juarez, we flew in, and as we started hitting the outskirts of Mexico City, flying at jet speed, it took us another hour to get to the airport. And the airport was in the middle of the city. Mexico City at the time had 25 million people. I have preached in several of the churches in Mexico City. One of the churches, the last one I remember preaching at, they announced that Dr. Ron Adams is going to be speaking tonight. I was in the pulpit of Dr. Ronaldo Gutierrez, who was a seminary professor at one of our seminaries in Mexico City. He was considered an intellectual. He'd written several books about theology and philosophy and other things. And he was under cancer treatment at the time for brain cancer. that he was receiving treatment, and I was asked to preach in his pulpit. For me, one of the highest honors I've ever been asked by a Latin American pastor to preach in his church and pulpit. I did what I always do in churches where I was overseas, and the most unusual building I've ever been in. The stage was about 4 feet, maybe 5 feet off the main floor, and the main floor sloped like this. They had a balcony that I could almost take in the edge of the stage and touch, and I could see the first people in the first chairs or benches on the first balcony. It was almost as I could touch them. And so the way the floor was angled this way, I could hardly see people underneath the balcony in the back of the building. And I did my sermon in Spanish that I would do occasionally in churches. And when I gave the invitation for people to respond to Christ, 50-something people stood up. The building was packed, by the way. I thought with announcing that I was coming, they wouldn't have anybody for service. But that night, over 50 people stood up and asked Jesus to come into their life. And I thought that was a strange thing. And so after the service, the deacon who had introduced me, I went to him and I said, "Brother Deacon, can you tell me what happened?" He said, "Well, Pastor, this is what happened. Our pastor preaches from the head to the head. You preach from the heart to the heart." And people responded. I could tell you that story in other places in Latin America, the most unusual place in Latin America that I spoke at. Remember, God can take you from a place where you never knew he could even find you and do things with you that you never thought were possible if you say yes. Yes. And do like Abraham and follow that in obedience wherever it leads you, to whatever profession it leads you. You don't have to give up and leave and go overseas to be a missionary. You can be a missionary where you are, and I hope you will. But the most unusual place I was in a place called Santa Cruz, Bolivia. Bolivia, La Paz Airport is the highest airport in the world. It's over 2 miles high. Denver is considered the mile-high city, right? It's a mile high, Denver, altitude. La Paz is twice that altitude. And when you get off the plane in La Paz, they don't let you get off the plane by yourself. They make you hold hands with the person behind you, and they escort you into the restaurant, in the airport, and give you a tea, because as soon as your feet hit the ground, many people will faint for lack of oxygen. And not unusual. That's why they hold hands so they won't fall. And so they give you this tea that helps your equilibrium adjust. And I got back on the plane and flew down to Santa Cruz. In Santa Cruz, I did some training for 3 or 4 days, and then my friend had scheduled me to speak in a church. Well, I didn't know. Once you get out of the proper city, there are no more roads, blacktop roads, paved roads. Everything else becomes dirt or a little bit of gravel. And in the rainy season, you have ruts about this deep all through the area in the country. And we drive our car to a place where we can stop, and then we walk. And as we're walking, and this is an Abraham story, by the way. Don't know if you ever heard these sounds, but I'm sure he had some others. As we were walking, have I told you this cat story about frogs? As we were walking, it was rainy season, and in Venezuela we had these little frogs about this big, maybe an inch, not quite 2 inches long. And when rainy season would start, which was around October-ish, we got rains in Venezuela when the hurricane stirred up in the Gulf, in the Caribbean, and we would get the backwash in the rain. And we'd get 6, 7 feet of rain a year, usually. But these little frogs would start their little singing about a couple of weeks before rainy season started. They'd come up out of the ground, and they'd do their little song, little frog song. My dad was so fascinated when he first visited with us the first year that he took his tape recorder, and as these frogs would sing, he would record them. And he took it home with him, and he would play it at night and put him to sleep with his tape recorder. All of you probably never seen a tape recorder, right? You have this thing here that's now but tape recorder. But anyway, in La Cruz, Santa Cruz, we were walking and I heard these sounds. I said, "You guys really have a lot of cats." He said, "That's not cats, that's frogs." I said, "It can't be frogs." So I didn't grow up in Missouri, which is the show me state, and I said, "I have to see this." So they took me over to a bush, and there that little rain frog was about this big, and he was sounding just like a cat. Meow, meow, meow. Crazy sound. So I had to see it. Well, one of the few times in life where I was at a different language church than Spanish in Latin America. It was a Quechua church. And so I preach in Spanish, and I have a Quechua translator, and he translates into the Quechua language among that high indigenous people group in that area. And again, the same kind of response. I don't know why that is. I'm a nobody. Just to try to tell anybody about somebody who can save their soul. And his name is Jesus. God can take a nobody from a no place and do great things, just like he took Abraham from a paganistic background, a family heritage of paganism, and made him into a person that still blesses you and I today by his faith, by his journey of faith. I'm going to say this. The safest place for you, the most secure place for you and me, is to be in the center of where God's will is for us at that moment. That's the safest place you can be. Abraham was surrounded by enemies. He was surrounded by pagan kings. He was surrounded by people that would have harmed him. But God was with him. And he became the father of nations, the father of faith. And he was justified by the same faith that you and I are justified. The difference is, he looked toward the coming of Jesus, though he never saw him. You and I look back to the cross, though we've never seen him physically. Faith is faith, no matter if it came 4,000 years before Jesus or if it came 2,000 years after Jesus. Faith is the same faith. And that's why Abraham is in that column of heroes of faith in Hebrews 11, is that he is a demonstration, an example of what following God by faith means. So I'm going to ask you a question to grapple with between here and the end of the term. Where is God calling you? In your prayer time, in your journaling, in your discovery, in your listening to Pastor Dale, in all that you're doing to try to discover. You're on a journey just like Abraham. You have a lot more resources than Abraham had. You have friends, you have people on staff, you have maybe even colleagues that share a similar journey with you. And it's good to have that time where you can share with each other. Proverbs talks about iron sharpening iron. As we have people that speak truth into our lives, and this can be done great in life groups. Life groups are essentially the way the New Testament church started. The New Testament church did not have a building like this big building that we have here. They didn't have a building like this. And as you read the book of Acts, especially chapter 2, it says they shared their faith daily from house to house. The last church we started in Venezuela before leaving to go to Thailand, we started in a house with about 20 adults. Most of those adults were professional folks. I may have alluded to some of that in that little handout I gave you the first class, but most of these adults were not full-time pastor types. They were best maybe bivocational to some degree, because as we were birthing the church, I planned a 3-month worship program for 3 months, 90 days. And I programmed who was going to speak on every Sunday, who was going to lead worship every Sunday. And I only spoke one Sunday a month on purpose because I wanted others to learn how to preach. I had doctors and dentists and engineers and university professors, many school teachers, just looking over the crowd, accountants, public CPAs. I'm looking back, this is over 20 years ago now, looking back in that room. And that's who we had, mainly couples. There were some singles, but young folks who were working in their profession. And in this period of growing the church from 20 adults over a period of years, we grew to well over 600. In about 10 years, we were at 600. That's about the way this church has grown in its first 10 years. But the thing that helped us grow faster were what we call there, that we don't use here, cell groups. We call them life groups here. So I trained 10 people on how to do life groups. When we left to go to Thailand from Venezuela, we had 100 life groups. 5 or 6 people gathering in homes, doing Bible studies, or whatever we had done that Sunday morning in church. They were rehashing that in their life groups, grappling with it, looking at some of the questions that arose out of hearing the sermon. And so those were just topics to get people to talk. Pastor Dale does that here. Misael is starting a series with the Spanish version of his book that he just did, Plenty Too Much. We did that in life group. So I say this. Most all of those folks that were in that original group are now pastoring somewhere in the country or out of the country. Out of that original group came multi-units that are preaching the gospel in other places, and I'm no longer there. My whole view of preparing people for ministry has tried to get me away as far as I can and let people do what they can do in the calling God's put on them. I'm going to give you a homework assignment. This is an interview that my daughter conducted with me and Frida. You may want to listen to hers as well, and my older son. She has a podcast, and if I'm correct, you can go on her podcast. If you have an app for podcasts, or if you know how to access podcasts off of a website, you look for A World of Difference is the title. A World of Difference. And the podcast is anchor.fm. If you have trouble, at a World of Difference site, it's on Anchor, ANCHOR .fm. And she's interviewed lots of people, but you look for Dr. Christopher Adams, my son, Frida Adams, Dr. Ron Adams as the third. Those were the first 3 interviews I think she did. And I would like for you to listen to mine, and then you can go back and listen to the others, but it's going to take you about an hour to do that. We had to do 2 different tapings of it because the first time, don't know what happened, but we just lost. And I talk a lot about how I was used as a chaplain in a disaster in Venezuela, and the results of what happened out of I'll relate a little bit to the tsunami because she has a date forever in her mind about that, and I do too because I was present when it happened with her. But she had no idea what happened with me some years before, in 1987. And so I talk about that. I'll send you also our next person that we're going to look at in God's calling on his life. So we've looked at Jonah, who was called to Nineveh at the very place that Abraham grew up, in Iraq. And Abraham left Iraq, Mesopotamia, as it was called in Bible geography, and he goes to Canaan. And there's a lot of things that happen with him, and I hope that you'll just continue to look at his life because he helps us to this very day on our faith journey. We all have one. It's all different. And just like today, as I was sharing with one of my patients, is that I am honored that at this stage of my life, God can still use me as I get the opportunity and the privilege and the honor of walking with people on a destination that will end soon. And to walk alongside them, to counsel them, to pray with them, to read scripture with them, and to help them process what happens after their loved one dies. I feel honored that I get invited into their life and they don't know me. And most of these that I've seen since March, I've never seen them face to face. It's by phone. And I get to do all of that by a phone call to people I've never met and to share how good God is, how compassionate God is, how God understands the life of Abraham and all that he endured and struggles he went through and the struggles we go through, and how he's there for us as we struggle with life and live life on life's terms that we've been given. I pray God's blessing on all of you. I pray that his face will continue shining on you, that he'll turn his face toward you, and that he'll give you peace. God bless you. How many of you are taking this for credit? All of you? That's what I thought. So I have to tell Shelley every week that all of you are taking this for credit. I'll see you next Wednesday. I guess we'll meet at this place next Wednesday. And same time, 6:30. I bring all the bad commercials with me when I come back. So you'll have to listen to the commercials again. See y'all next week.